This is called What You Need to Know About the Airfields That We Fly Past. And the premise is that the days when we could fly around and ignore everyone else are pretty much gone. It's too crowded for that. And the airspace that we fly in particularly is pretty crowded. And it's really useful to know what other people do and how we can work with them. So that's where we're going with this. And here's the agenda. This is what I'm going to talk about. This really started off by thinking about airfields that had instrument traffic, because I know that most glider pilots don't really understand what instrument pilots do and what they're trying to achieve and where they are. And we've had a couple of air proxies as a consequence of that, really. So I'm going to talk a bit about why we should care. Then I'm going to look at some of the civilian airfields with instrument approaches in Class G. And those are the ones that are tricky because that's where we fly, typically. But I thought it was also worth talking a little bit about some of the military airfields we fly past, because they vary quite a lot in terms of what they're doing and how we have to handle them when we go there. And I've got a couple of slides on just a reminder of some simple RT calls and a bit about where to find the data that helps us talk to these people. So that's more or less an afterthought. So we're going to focus really on the different airfields. So let's start here. Why should we care about instrument traffic? We're glider pilots, right? We don't care about that. But many of the airfields we fly past have instrument approaches. This chart on the right is the sort of instrument approach that we might see at Cambridge, one of them, and we'll talk about that in a bit more. And in a way, they're like roads that we cross. As we're traveling around, it's like walking across roads, and some of them are nice country roads and some of them are motorways. So it's sort of worth knowing which are which. The people doing this, the aircraft flying the instrument approaches, aren't very good at keeping a good lookout. You know, I know they should, but realistically they don't. And the reason for that is a lot of them are training. So you've got two people sitting in the front of, I don't know, a twin perhaps, or maybe a single engined aircraft. One of them isn't looking out at all. He might well have screens up to prevent him looking out, or her, or alternatively, some other sort of vision restricting device. And then the instructor sitting in the right-hand seat is spending part of his time coaching the guy in the left-hand seat, looking at what they're doing, part of the time monitoring the airplane, and part of the time looking out. And I know when I've done instrument renewals with instructors, I've been conscious that there have been quite big periods of time when neither of us have been looking out very well. So if we're flying in a glider where these people are, given how difficult we are to see in the first place, there's a really good chance they won't see us. So we're sort of relying on the big sky approach for them to miss us. So my premise is that if we know something about where these approaches are and what the aircraft are doing in those approaches, we'll have a better understanding of how to deal with that. And if you look at a 500,000 map, you'll find on the holds and the final approach track, you'll see the chevrons on the map. But the approaches are much more extensive than that. We're going to have a look at that in a moment. So this is a picture of the airspace to the west of Cambridge, of us here. We've got Cambridge to the east, and then all these blue lines are instrument approaches. So if you look at coming out of Gransden, which is here, I think, and going west, it's actually quite difficult not to fly through some of these instrument approaches, if not impossible. So we're doing that. We need to and so understanding where they are, what people are doing is quite important. So what should we do? Well, first thing is that we can actually talk to the airfields that we're passing and tell them where we are. That helps. Now, the CAA advice is to call when you're within 10 nautical miles, so 20 kilometers of an airfield with an instrument approach. That's actually quite hard. That's a long way. And we don't often do it to that extent. But we ought to take care before we're flying through the final approach track or a hold. I'll come to what a hold is in a moment. It's best not to plan to do that if we can avoid it. But if we're going to do it, if circumstances dictate, we can at least ask to see whether there's traffic in them, and maybe tactically plan like that. If we're on the right frequency, we can listen to what other people are doing. So other aircraft flying an approach will often report at one of the fixes. So if you know where the fixes are, you know where they are. So you might hear something like Golf Charlie Delta, tip go, 3,000 feet. Tip go is a waypoint. It's an IFR, an instrument flying rules waypoint, a bit like the BGA waypoints, and they're all pronounced as a whole word. If an aircraft reports beacon outbound, it means they're leaving the beacon above or near to the airfield, and will be flying away from the airfield to later turn onto a final approach. Again, we'll look at some examples of that. If it reports established, it means it's now on the final approach track, so going into the airfield. Fully established means it's on a glide path. The particular area of conflict with us as glider pilots are in the holds, because they're at the sort of operating altitudes that we are, greater than 2,000 feet. And as they descend or route to the final approach fix, after that, they're getting below 2,000 feet, and we generally don't like to be there. But then after that, when they do the missed approach, go around and go back to the hold, we might see them there. So let's have a look at one of those. A few useful acronyms that you might come across. Something called an NDB, which is a non-directional beacon. Very old technology used by aircraft for approaches. You basically have a needle in the aircraft which points in the right direction of this thing. Really, really old technology, dates back to the Second World War. ILS is an instrument landing system. That's a ground-based system which can guide, which gives you three-dimensional guidance down to the runway or close to the runway. More recently, we have things called RNP approaches, which stands for Required Navigation Performance. That's almost always GPS, and it doesn't require ground-based aids. We've got the final approach track, which we talked about. That usually goes out to about 5 to 10 nautical miles or 10 to 20 kilometers. On that final approach track is the final approach fix. And we have the glide path and glide slope, the bit of the final approach track where the aircraft is descending. And usually that's about a 3-degree slope, so 300 feet per nautical mile. So that gives us some idea of what we're looking at. Right, so let's have a look at some real life examples. Some civilian airfields with instrument approaches in Class G. And we'll start with the one we know well, which is Cambridge. As everybody ought to know, we have a memorandum of understanding with Cambridge, and basically we've set up something called a radio advisory zone, which is a bit like a radio mandatory zone, but only advisory. And we'll give them a call before we get in there, so they know where we are. And we've said we'll try not to fly through their holds, at least not without checking there's no one there. On their part, they're going to warn other aircraft about our activity, which they do quite well. We give them a call in the morning, tell them we're flying, how active we are. They put that on their ATIS, which is the broadcast they make about the weather and other conditions at the airfield. And they try quite hard to avoid routing people over Cambridge Gliding Club low. If I fly the Mooney, I've got a share in out of Cambridge, and I'm coming somewhere near Granston. They're very good at saying, beware, Granston is active. So this works pretty well for us. They do have a radar system, but only sometimes. So if when you're listening on frequency, they talk about Cambridge approach, they don't have radar. But if their call sign is Cambridge radar, they do have radar. If you've got a transponder, their system is old enough that they can't see your mode SID. So you will have put your call sign into the transponder. They can't see that. All they can see is the 4-digit code that you're squawking. For those of us without transponders, they might be able to see a primary return. So just a blip on the screen. So they might have some idea of where you are. Okay, so here's Cambridge, and on this I've put the different instrument approaches. So Cambridge quite commonly has instrument traffic. It's one of the airfields in southern UK which has a good range of instrument approaches, and as a consequence, quite a lot of people come from other places to do training at Cambridge, and there's a fairly active flying school there. So there's a lot of largely GA, general aviation, traffic, singles, twins, that sort of thing. There's the occasional jet. They've got a jet center at Cambridge. So you get the occasional business aviation jet, which comes in, and marshals have a business where they do up Hercules and the like, which are the big 4-engine transports the Air Force and other air forces use. So you see those there as well. So there's quite a range of aircraft coming into Cambridge. It's reasonably busy, and we see that quite often when we fly through this zone. So the purple line here, this one, the purple line here is the radio advisory zone. That's not a legal thing, that's just the agreement that we have with them. This red circle in the middle is the air traffic zone. That is a legal thing. We must ask permission to go in there, up to 2,000 feet above ground. And then these blue lines are the instrument approaches. So the little oval racetrack here is the hold. It's the hold for when they're on runway 23. So we've got runway 23 coming in that way, and runway 05 coming in that way. Because of the prevailing winds and the fact that they have an ILS on runway 23, that's their preference. So they'll often be using that even if there's a slight tailwind. So,
well, Paul, can I just, this is a good moment to ask a question that David Jockenan has asked,
sure.
Which is, you've indicated the holes here.
Yep.
How, in general, do we know where they are? Because they aren't marked on the 500,000 chart.
No, you know where they are because that's the purpose of this talk, so I can tell you where the holds are. Where is the source information for this? You can go to the AIP and find them. Actually, I think I can't remember. Are the NDBs on the 500,000? I don't remember.
Yes, I think they are.
Yeah, I think you might find the NDB on the 500,000 chart. We'll have a look because I've got 1 or 2 500,000 pictures later, and we'll see if we can find a hold on one of those. But as we'll find out in a moment when we get to Cranfield, they're not the NDBs and the holds are not necessarily on the airfield. And you've basically got to listen to somebody like this, or you've got to go dig quite hard to find out this information. And precisely because it's difficult is why I'm doing this talk. Is anything else, Andrew, or does that answer that?
No, that's only the one question in the queue at the moment. That
okay,
thanks.
Super. So anyway, Cambridge have a beacon, an non-directional beacon on the airfield. It's just north of the runway, and it's called Charlie Alpha Mike. And if you hear somebody talking about Charlie Alpha Mike, that's what they're talking about. If they talk about the beacon, that's what they're talking about. And their hold is based around this, and it's a right-hand hold. The aircraft will go into the hold and then turn right. And this is about a 4-minute circuit, 4-minute oval. And depending on how fast the airplane is going, this will get bigger or smaller. Typically, the aircraft are at 3,000 feet or 4,000 feet or 5,000 feet if there's more than one there. So that's very much at our operating altitudes. And as I say, the people flying that are not going to be very good at looking out. So if you hear somebody going around the hold, if you ask, do you have anybody in your hold? And they say, yeah, it's probably worth staying away from this bit of airspace. If they're going to use their instrument landing system or one of the other old style approaches, then they'll go outbound here onto runway 23 towards Newmarket and descend to about 1,700 feet and then come back in, intercept the glide path and then descend on that. So it's this first bit where they're conflicting with us. So if you're struggling and you're getting below 2,000 feet in this, 2,000 feet in this area, then, and you've got somebody going outbound, then there's a potential conflict. But once they're on the glide path, hopefully you're higher than they are. And it's for that reason that if you're talking to Cambridge Air Traffic, Cambridge, they might well be more interested in how high you are than exactly where you are, because if they know you're at 3,000 feet, you're going to be clear of most of this lot. There's what's called an NDB approach, so that's an approach just using the NDB onto the other runway, 05, and that comes out this way, quite close to us actually, at Granston, and then turns back in. Most people won't use that now. That's very much a training thing. Like many things in aviation, we're teaching for 30 years ago rather than now. So people learning for the test will do that sort of thing. Once you've got the test, you don't touch it. But the thing that is different and new, or relatively new, are the RMP approaches, the GPS approaches. So here you've got, you're using a moving map GPS in the airplane, and in that are a series of waypoints which you can fly past onto the approach. And for runway 23, there are two places, strictly three if you include the middle bit, but two main places where you can join this. This one's called TIPCO. You're coming from the south, it's called GoPod. So if somebody wants to fly an instrument approach into Cambridge, they'll join at TIPCO at 3,000 feet. Notice that it is pretty much in the Mildenhall mats, and then descend to 2,000 feet along here, and then intercept the glide path going down here. Similarly, from this direction, you can go in through GoPod, or if they're on 05, the traffic might well be coming quite close to us past Granston to get down to BPOX. So the instrument approaches are much less constrained with RMP approaches than the old ones. So takeaways on that: the middle bit, often where we are in terms of height. The instrument approach is sometimes a bit lower if we're comfortable, but it could be that if we're struggling a bit, we're going to conflict. And talking to Cambridge, listening to what's happening, helps us understand where that traffic is and be able to look for it. If you land at Cambridge, they're pretty friendly. We've got a reasonably good relationship with them. You do need to ask permission to enter the ATZ, and you do need to ask permission to land. So everybody who's done the RT course or the bronze course ought to know that. But it's important. If you bust in there and get the frequency wrong, can't talk to them, land, you're not going to be flavour of the month. If you are going to land, it's probably best to land on the grass. So this is the main runway 2305. But there's a grass runway here, which is a bit more difficult to see in this image, but I've outlined it in red. And you would want to land on that because that isn't used much. So you could land on that, push your glider off. It wouldn't be a problem. You'll probably be able to air a tow out. There have been a couple of years when they didn't think we could do that, but I think we've gotten to the point of agreeing that we can air a tow out of there now. I'm getting that confirmed by the air traffic manager, but he's reasonably comfortable with that. And we Wendy landed there last season, and we would have aerotowed out except for the front coming through Granston at the time. But I think actually what we did was a road retrieve via a gate on this side. So that was quite convenient as well. So don't worry about Cambridge. Very friendly, very helpful. Just need to talk to them. Right. Cranfield. Cranfield's a bit different. Cranfield is driven by research. It's part of the airfield is an adjunct of the university there. It's not really driven by general aviation. So, for example, they've set it up so they can close air traffic, they can close the airfield whenever they need to. There's no requirement to stay open, which they would have to do if they were a certain level of public airfield. They are generally helpful to gliders, but we have to understand we're not their first priority. So if they've got a jet in the circuit, they might tell you to get lost.
Well, can I just interject briefly? There's just a couple of things on the last slide.
Yep.
One, you're probably going to want to save to the end, but I'll ask it now anyway. David Jockenan says, how might we request or acknowledge landing on the grass runway at Cambridge? What would be said by each party? Sounds to me like, David, we could usefully invite you onto the radio course that we've been running.
Well, I have an RT license, but I just wanted to just get a quick, run through of how the conversation would probably play out specifically at Cambridge.
Okay, so it's unlikely you're just going to go, Cambridge, can I join and land? Okay, that's not how this works. So you're getting lower and lower, and so you're going to ask Cambridge Approach Glider 28, request enter the ATZ to thermal. That might be your starting point. And they'll say ATZ entry, permission to enter the ATZ granted or something like that. So in you go. And then after a while, you're getting lower and lower, and you say, Cambridge, they might switch you over to tower, so you need to be able to do that. So they might say, Cambridge Tower, going to need to land, request land 23 grass. And they'll say, Roger, call downwind 23 grass. So you'd say, then you call downwind, and after that it's simple. So you basically tell them what you want to do. I'd like to land on the grass. If you can't remember the exact phraseology, I'd like to land on the grass will work fine.
Yeah, okay, it's good. I actually got halfway through that story a couple of weeks ago. I got your transit approved to enter the ATZ to thermal.
Yeah.
I managed to get away, but I could have ended up having to do the second part of that story. And I just wanted to be clear on what it would say. Say, yeah, I'd like to land on the grass runway. Like, if I know it's going to be direction 23, it'd say, permission to, can I have permission to land on runway 23, the grass runway, something like that.
Yeah.
And they would say, negative, or they would say, approved to, cleared to land runway 23 grass. They'd say something like that, right?
So you're going to tell them you want to land on the grass.
Yeah.
And then you're going to make a couple of conventional calls. So you might say downwind, left hand, 23 grass. And they'll say, Roger, report final. And you'll say final 23 grass. And they'll say clear to land.
Okay.
And you'll say clear to land, runway 23, grass, whatever your glider is. Okay.
Okay.
You're a glider. If they don't say clear to land and you're on final, you're going to land anyway. So that's,
yeah, they can't tell you go around.
No, they can't say go around.
Unable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But you can do it. You can do it politely. It's important to do it politely.
Yeah, it's mainly about asking and communicating with them and telling them what you're doing, so they can hold somebody else who might have been conflicted. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I have thermal over the middle of that airfield at about 600 feet.
Right.
But I was doing it on the basis of, guys, this is what I want to do. If you need me to land, tell me.
Right.
If I'm getting in the way, tell me.
Right.
Okay. And I got away.
Thank you.
Right.
And as both you pointed out, and Ed has also put into the chat channel, you'll almost certainly, by the time you're in circuit, you'll almost certainly have been transferred to the tower frequency.
Yeah. They'll put you to the tower when they think you might be getting into the circuit.
Is it worth mentioning, Paul, that the circuit's normally going to the south at Cambridge, if people aren't aware of that?
That is true, Wendy, but I wouldn't worry greatly about that, to be honest. I mean, if I were a glider trying to thermal, they'd probably be happier for me to.
Well, I mean, they are. I mean, that time I landed there last year, I specifically requested permission to do a circuit to the north.
Yeah.
But it's worth people knowing that generally the circuits in the Cambridge are to the south.
Yeah, all the power stuff will be doing circuits to the south. That's correct. Yeah, mostly for noise abatement reasons. Yeah. Okay. All right. Back to Cranfield. We good on that? Okay. Cranfield don't have radar. They're completely procedural, which is slightly problematic because they are quite busy. If you land there, you're likely to be able to get Naruto out when it's convenient to them. They can't guarantee to send somebody out to hold your wing, so you better be good at doing it without that. You can get a road retrieve, but there are some difficulties because they won't let anybody drive on the airfield when it's open. So either you'll need to move the glider to the ground side, which I think there's a big enough hole in the fence that you could put your trailer one side and get the glider out that way, or wait till the airfield closes. At Cranfield, they've got a fair amount of GA flying training, maintenance, and it's used a lot by people coming from, in particular, Oxford. So training aircraft and such like. This is what their approaches look like. Now, this is really interesting for us because here's Cranfield. Can we see that pointer? Andrew, can we see that pointer?
Yes.
Okay, good. So here's Cranfield. Cranfield's beacon, Charlie India Tango, is a few miles away. And it's just west of Bedford. And if you think about all the active cross-country pilots here, we often fly that sort of route. We come in across Bedford, straight through their holds. Oh, sorry. Straight through their holds. In fact, planning to go over the top of Cranfield works much better from that point of view, because the holds are where the aircraft are up at 2,500 feet or higher. I think the bottom of the hold is 2,500. The next one up would be 3,500. And so when they've got procedural traffic doing an ILS, an instrument landing system, or an NDB approach, it goes around this hold, and then one of two things will happen. Either it will extend out to about, I think it's about 8 miles from CIT, and then go back and join the final approach and descend. Or if they've done a missed approach to come out this way, they'll go straight back through the beacon, then outbound in an oval shape like that. So this area to the northeast of Cranfield is pretty busy if they've got instrument traffic. And I have been through here when unusually they wouldn't give me a service. And the reason they wouldn't give me a service was they had at least 3 aircraft stacked in this hold. They had various other people on frequency, and they were just completely maxed out. They do have an instrument approach onto the other runway. So the other way, the Cranfield is, I think, 2103. And that's an NDB approach, which goes a long way out and then comes back in. But again, Cranfield have got a series of RNP approaches, which come in from these places: Addison, Bapis, Bevlou, and down here, Decap and Dotit. But look at how far these go out. This point here, Bapis, is just to the west of Grafham Water. So if we're flying up here, we're not thinking about Cranfield as a threat, but it is, because that's where their instrument approaches start. So you could easily have aircraft coming in at 2,000 feet, maybe having gone around and then flown back out to one of these points, come back at 2,000 feet. And one of our members had a very, very serious air props here at this intersection. So the intermediate approach fix on the RMP at 2,000 feet, and he missed, or a twin missed him by tens of feet. That person now has a transponder in their aircraft, but Cranfield don't have radar, so that won't help particularly. Worth also noting that Sywell up here, which is a much smaller general aviation airfield with light aircraft only, does have an instrument approach, but this one is, I think they're only allowed to do 6 approaches a day, and they don't have training using it. So this is going to be much, this approach is going to be much less used than Cranfield, which is really quite busy. So my recommendation, if you're going through Cranfield, is absolutely to give them a call. I am talking to Cranfield on behalf of the BGA at the moment, with a view to setting up an equivalent of what we do at Cambridge, which is a radio advisory zone. And at the moment, what we're talking about is having something that covers the ATZ and then goes out and covers the hold and the alternative approach here. So it doesn't get right out to these RMP approaches, but it does at least cover this stuff that we often go through. So I think that's all I want to say on that one. Oxford, I think we're sort of going up in difficulty here. Oxford is a major GA commercial training airport and a jet general aviation base. It's very busy. It's not a good place to land. I'd happily land at Cranfield. I'd happily land at Cambridge. I'd stay away from Oxford unless desperate. It's got very active instrument approaches. Either avoid them or talk to them if you're going there. It does have radar, and if you've got a transponder, it does have a listening squawk. So the listening squawk is 4517. There's the frequency 125090. So a listening squawk, for those who don't know, is what a transponder does is puts a 4-digit code and possibly your call sign on the radar controller's screen. And if you're talking to a radar controller, they will say squawk 4321, for example. You put 4321 on your little box and it appears on the screen, so they know who you are. A listening squawk is for when you're not talking to them, but you are listening to what they're doing, and you put this code, 4517 in Oxford's case, and they know they can call you if they want to. So here's Oxford. In a way, this one is protected because we've got the Bryce Norton Class D here, this red line, and we've got Western on the green here. So it's not frequently that we're flying through this bit of airspace where their holds are and where their approaches are. But sometimes it happens. When I find myself getting through Oxford, generally when I'm going north-south. So if I've been down to Didcot or somewhere and I'm going Leicester, wherever, and I come up to the north, and then I've got 2 choices. I can either route here, probably east of Western on the Green, or what I've done a few times is come up through Bryce Norton and up here. And at least once I've got a clearance through this bit of Bryce up through here, and then Bryce have asked me if I'd be happy to talk to Oxford, and so I called Oxford and worked my way up through here, and they're much happier hearing from you because then they know what you're going to do. And for example, I've voluntarily limited my climb because they had somebody in the hold as I went through here. But these guys have got ILSs which do that or that. I think that's an NDB approach to the south. I've marked some RMP approaches on here. They're the things that go further out, but I think that was a proposal. I don't think they've actually happened. So Oxford is a bit more dense than it seems on this chart. Okay. Gloucester we going out to the west, some way we get Gloucester, another busy GA airfield, less commercial training, but quite a lot of GA stuff. And they've got a bunch of approaches too. Their hold is Golf Sierra Tango on the airfield. So don't go straight over the top of them without talking to them. And then they've got approaches that go out quite a long way, and in the same way that all the others, with similar sorts of heights. You begin to see the pattern here. We've got we've got holds at a few thousand feet, and then we've got things out to the side which start at 2,000 feet and go down. Okay, so those are the main civilian airfields that we see a lot of with instrument approaches in Class G. Actually, there aren't very many others in the country. Humberside, I think, and Exeter. I guess there are an increasing number of RMP approaches going into smaller airfields. So, for example, Shoreham at Brighton has one, but that's happening quite slowly. All right, now let's talk about the military, because they're sort of interesting as well. And if you're flying around cross country, you'll come across these guys quite a lot. So Mildenhall and Lakenheath are the first ones to think about. Mildenhall, which is the one to the southwest in that particular cluster, has tankers and transport aircraft. So if you're unlucky, you'll get the view that we have on the left there. And this is what they can see, which is really not very much. So absolutely don't rely on them being able to see you. It's not going to happen. Lakenheath Radar is the controlling authority for both Lakenheath and Mildenhall. That's who you need to talk to. You can ask for a basic service and a MATS penetration. I'll give you the MATS penetration automatically because the MATSs don't mean much to them. Thank you, Andrew, for pointing this point out, which is that you must give your position in relation to Lakenheath or Mildenhall or Bury or Ely or Newmarket. They won't know other places. Their turnover of staff is high. Andrew goes and talks to them on a regular basis, and every time he sees a new bunch of faces. And they just don't know the other places. So if you say you're overhead Stowmarket, there'll just be a puzzled sound coming from the other end of the radio. But if you can say you're 10 miles southeast of Lakenheath, that's much better for them. I'm just going to pause slightly because my blinds have decided to come down and they're making noise. Okay. So one of the things I do on my nav kit is on my airfield page on the LX, I have a couple of nav boxes that tell me my bearing from and distance to whatever airfield I'm looking at in nautical miles. And that makes it really easy to give a position report that an air traffic controller can understand, because I can tell them exactly how far I am on what bearing from them. If you want to land at either Mildenhall or Lakenheath, it's only going to happen if you declare an emergency and expect to be met by an armed guard. Once they've decided you're not a threat, they're very friendly. But that might put you off a little bit. Wendy and I were flying through past Lakenheath last season under 88's Stratus with very little lift around, and Wendy asked to enter the ATZ and they refused. So she said she was going to land at somewhere near to them. So suddenly they changed their mind and let her in. So they will help, but they'll keep you out of the ATZ as long as possible.
The answer is to say that you're going to land at Beltwell.
Well, that was it. Yes, I was trying to remember the name of the place. It worked brilliantly, didn't it? They were suddenly enthusiastic for you to get into their ATZ. So you were about here and wanted to do that. Okay. The thing about Mildenhall is its radar circuit is outside the MATS. So you might think that because you're not in the MATS, you're safe. but that's unfortunately not true. So these big aeroplanes with a poor view, typically at around 3,000 feet, are going to be doing that this sort of circuit. And if you're here or here, you're on the climb out. Talking to them is good. I have been through here, and they were saying, "Can you turn away?" Because we're trying to get somebody away. Unfortunately, I saw a hang glider about here, so I said, "I can see a hang glider. I'll go and circle underneath him, so you know where he is," and that helped. Okay, transponders help a lot with these guys. If you've got a transponder and you're squawking, they will keep everything away from you, which is just wonderful. Lakenheath, though, different kettle of fish entirely. It's a fast jet base. It flies this sort of thing, F-15s, and quite a lot of them. It has a series, 3 points where traffic tends to exit and enter the mats. Point Charlie here, next to Feltwell, just where Wendy was. Point Bravo or Point Delta to the east. So often you'll hear flights of F-15s coming in, radar controlled, at about 3,000 feet, and vectoring into the visual circuit for Lakenheath. So they're radar controlled down to here, then they join the visual circuit and land, or going the other way, they might come out that way. They're very fast. If they're coming directly towards you, you're probably not going to see them very easily. So again, being in contact with Lakenheath is a good thing. Okay. Let's move west a bit and Wittering. If you're doing the Club 300, so East or Calvert, Railway Junction, you're going to at least once go through Wittering's mats probably. And that's quite different. That's the home of air experience flights and university air squadrons. And they fly these things, little tutors. They're generally pretty helpful, but over the last couple of years, they've been fairly short-staffed. So it's difficult to get much out of them, but again, worth the call. I did a few weeks ago hear them giving an instrument approach to some military training aircraft from, I think, Cranwell. And that was what's called a PAR, precision approach radar. So that's when you have a radar talk down person. So they'll be given radar vectors to the final approach track, and then talked down. You know, you're slightly higher high on glide, the glide slope, increase your rate of descent. You're too low, decrease your rate of descent, turn left 2 degrees, etc. Which is the way that the military do some of these things. Marham, we go back east a little bit, is the home to the RAF's very expensive new fighter, the F-35 Lightning, which are tens of millions of pounds each. So not surprisingly, they're quite protective. So unlike, say, Lakenheath, who will have absolutely no problem with you being in the mats, Marham will be quite insistent that you aren't in their mats if they're launching or recovering fast jets. They can't actually legally do that, but it doesn't seem to me to be entirely unreasonable to do what they ask. Again, as in all cases, ATZ entry requires permission. The Air Force is generally not active at the weekends, and that's the case at Marham particularly. At the weekends, you tend to get, if you call Marham, you'll tend to get somebody with a handheld who's part of the Royal Air Force Gliding and Soaring Association, flying their gliders off Marham. It's probably possible to land there. I'm not sure how they are now that they've got the F-35s. You probably wouldn't have a great problem the weekend. In the week, you might have to be fairly insistent to get them to agree to it, but you could do it. Again, possibly expect men with guns. If we look up to Lincolnshire, we have this string of associated matses And I think for the reasons that I'll explain in a moment, probably the best thing is, at least during weekdays, is to stay out of that. So we have Cranfield, which is a training base flying phenoms and prefects. So they're turboprop training aeroplanes. Used to be jet provosts and then Tucanos, but they've retired all those. Barkston Heath is a little relief landing ground for Cranfield. It's where they go when their circuit's really busy. Go north a little bit, we've got Waddington, which has big sentries. That's the airborne early warning aircraft, and various other things that look a bit like that. Go east to Coningsby and you've got Typhoons, so more fast jets. And then up here in Scampton, you've got the Red Arrows. And note that you've got this Romeo 313 restricted area rather, which when it's hot, if you talk to Waddington, you can ask, is R313 hot or not? Or they'll tell you it's hot or tell you it's not hot. And that means that you can or can't go in there as appropriate. So you might even see the Red Arrows. But it seems to me that when the Air Force is active, this is probably not a profitable line of flight to fly up. Go up a bit west, or if you have to, a bit east. Wattisham and Benson, we go through there quite a lot. They're both helicopter bases, so they don't have stuff that really gets in our way. They're generally a lot lower than us. Wattisham is Army Air Corps Apaches. Again, at the weekend, you've got a gliding club, so quite friendly. Benson, Pumas and Chinooks have come up, their Air Force. They are quite good at providing a service for this Oxford area of intense aerial activity. So if you've got a transponder, it's probably worth talking to Benson. You'll get decent traffic information, and there's a lot of stuff coming through this area. Bryce, I thought would be worth a quick talk about. That's a transport base, and that's Class D, of course. So Class D, most of you will know, is you must have a clearance, a proper clearance to go into Class D. They will provide a lower airspace radar service. That's what a LARS means. And Bryce radar do that. Not hugely useful as a glider pilot. If you want to get a crossing, you need to talk to Bryce Zone. And I've been up through the eastern part of this quite often, and they've always been very helpful. It's never been a problem to get a controlled airspace crossing. So, but you can't guarantee it. Okay, so that was the scamper through various airfields. I thought I'd give you a quick reminder about simple RT calls and a little advert onto where to get all the frequency data for all those calls that I've been talking about. So here's our RT call. So glider Cambridge approach, glider 28, request basic service. Glider 28, Cambridge approach, pass your message. Glider 28, 1 mile south of Bourne, altitude 4,000 feet, QNH 1021, next turning point, Bury St Edmunds. Glider 28, roger, basic service report leaving the frequency. And then a bit later, and we say basic service Wilco, glider 28, and a bit later, changing en route. So it's not terribly hard. If you want to brush up on your RT, watch the videos on the BGA Fertile course. That you can use those as a good refresher. You don't have to do the course. There's the link for it. If you don't have an RT license, come and do the course that Andrew and I run. We'll probably be doing it again early next year is the next one. But there's nothing to stop you self-studying using the material. The other thing I'd point you at is the data on with current airfield frequencies. And I publish a set of data with current airfield and landouts, including frequencies. And they fit together and are mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive with the BGA turning point file, which we include as well. And that contains all the gliding sites, again with frequencies. and they're in a cup format, which works for most nav systems, and we keep them up to date, making releases when things change. So you can sign up to be told when things have changed. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Let's come out of that. Andrew, have we got any questions?
Yeah, there was an unanswered question from much earlier. Steve unfortunately had to leave the call, but he asked way back at the beginning, let me scroll back here. He asked, does the UK leaving the EU, and in particular the EU, I guess, GPS, GLONASS, no, not GLONASS, GNSS arrangements, change any of these GPS approaches?
Yes, but not in a way that's significant for us. So one of the consequences of the, well, actually, it's not the fact that we're leaving, it's partly the fact that we're leaving the EU, but our government have decided not to be part of both Galileo, which is the sat-nav system, and something called EGNOS, which provides safety of life services using that sat-nav system. And as a consequence, this country will lose access to very high precision GPS approaches, but only the very high precision ones. I don't think any of the airfields we've talked about actually have those high precision approaches anyway, so it won't make a big difference to them. So it's a big area of conversation for the instrument flying community, but as far as the impact on us as glider pilots is concerned, it's not significant.
And that's it for the questions that were asked during the session. So, but I suggest you throw it open to.
Okay. Yes, I think we have a chance now for people to just unmute themselves if they want to and make any comments or ask any other questions.
So I'll just kick off with one quick observation whilst everyone's unmuting themselves. And it's more an observation than a question. One of the nice things about Cambridge is even when they don't have radar, they do have direction finding. So as soon as you press the push to talk button, the controller will see a line on a display that shows which direction you are from the airfield. They won't know how far away you are, they won't know how high you are, but they will at least have a rough idea which direction you are.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, quite a lot of the places we've talked about have that. You can see that on the 500,000 map as well, because it will say VDF next to the airfield with the frequency that you can call on for that.
Can I make one point with regard to Benson? And that is that unlike many other military airfields, it is very busy on Sundays. They're so busy with the rotary aircraft Monday to Friday that Sundays they fill up with the University Air Squadron, which is based there, and also the Air Experience flight. So they do run quite a busy 7-day operation there.
Okay, that's a good point. Thanks, Shane. Have they still got Oxford down there? Have they? I think.
Yes, Oxford is still at Benson.
I learned to fly with Oxford University Air Squadron when it was at Abingdon, and so Benson was our relief landing ground. We'd go there occasionally.
Can I ask a question, Paul? Is there any training material at CGC on use of transponders?
We have, if you look at the material that we did on the RT course, we give you quite a lot of stuff about, we cover all the transponder usage there.
Okay. Thanks.
Sorry, who was that?
It's Binu Patel. I've joined from Bistra with the club about 4 or 5 months.
Okay.
And
yeah, that's all right. I recognise the name now. I just didn't recognise the voice. Yeah, I mean, we're not teaching the actual buttonology, but that's pretty simple. But we certainly teach all the RT phraseology. So you can find that if you look at the RT course and the theoretical knowledge part of that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, it's Tony Pledger. Just, I suppose, in support of what you were saying about the GPS approaches and their emergence now. I mean, it used to be a lot easier, didn't it, with the feathers indicating the ILS approach, and you find, for instance, with Cambridge that there was a northeast, southwest kind of axis that your eyes drawn to avoid. But with the GPS entry points now, like Tipco, etc., straddled out there, my own experience of being I trained at Cambridge is really you've got aircraft almost within a 10 nautical mile circle of Cambridge, bumbling around positioning for those GPS approaches, and also asking for radar vectors through ILS, etc. So the old-fashioned axis by the feathers is sort of breaking down a bit, and you've got much more of a wide area training within 10 nautical miles, haven't you?
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to get over by putting those RMP approaches on the chart, and also the point that the feathers generally, once they're on those feathers, they're lower than us.
Yes.
Cambridge in particular has got didn't show it on the chart, but there's one of the ways to get to the ILS is something called a 10 DME arc.
Yeah.
So you fly using distance measuring equipment at a circle at a distance of 10 miles from Cambridge until you reach the final approach track and then turn onto it. So yeah, aeroplanes could be anywhere, but I think as I said earlier, the holds where the conflict is most likely to occur, but not exclusively by any means.
Paul, if we're going to land at a place like Cambridge or Cranfield, where would you land? Would you land like short, or would you try to land near the end of the runway? And what should you do immediately after you land? Should you push your glider off the runway? Like, what should you do?
So it would depend on which one we were talking about. Cambridge, I'd land on the grass and then just push the glider off the grass off the actual runway. But the grass doesn't get used very often, so I'm not going to be in anybody's way. Cranfield, I'd probably land on the harder. But I have landed there a couple of times, and they did get me to. They did at that time get you to land on the grass in front of the tower, but I don't think they'll do that now. And in talking to them, which I've been doing, they would want you to land on the hard. If I was doing that, I would probably pick a point where I could fairly easily move the airplane off onto a taxiway. So precision landing, not necessarily right at the end, but if I had the capacity and the time, I'd think about what I was going to do after I landed. Only do that if you've got the capacity and the time. Otherwise, just land on the runway somewhere. You can always push it off to the side.
Okay, but trying to clear the runway is something that
that's useful because you're going to block. Otherwise, you're blocking the runway.
You're just blocking it for everyone else,
and they're going to be a bit pissed off about that eventually.
Okay. Another point. Another pilot who landed at a military airfield said they would not let him leave until he identified himself. He had to show ID. Make sure he's not a foreign spy who just dropped in for a visit or something like that, I guess, is their thinking. So I've now added my driver's license to my checklist of things to take in the gliders, so I'd have a way to identify myself.
Having photo ID is a pretty useful thing if you're going to land a military base.
Yeah. So is there anything else to consider, just like when landing somewhere, especially at a military airfield? Anything you can do just to make it less of a stressful experience for anybody?
Yes, I have in my glider I carry a tow rope.
Right.
Because if I'm going to land somewhere and we've got to move the aeroplane, they're not going to have a glider tow rope. So I've got a little bag. It's got a tow rope. It's got a safety blanket. It's got a little bit of food. It's got a cable that I can charge my phone on, because you don't want a phone that you're on the internet and you run out of power before your crew gets there. So there's a little emergency kit, and that lives in the glider. But a tow rope is a really important part of that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I've got one, but I don't carry it in the glider. But I can see the point.
So we used to sell them at the club, little nylon tow ropes. They're not very big, they sort of fold down into that big, and I think that's worth having.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? in which case I suspect we're done. It's looking a nice day tomorrow, so I may see some of you at the airfield.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
I will say good night.
Cool. See you then.
Thank you.
Thanks very much,
All right.
Paul. Brilliant.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.